Uh, so we say like they're giving the students like the link. Who's to say that every student at this school is 16 to 18? Like,
Okay. So we're not collecting it. Let's just say this. Let's just assume that they're only given to 16 to 18-year-olds. Because it depends on how high schools are defined. Some high schools are only 10th through 12th grade, which would be
Aren't we also asking how old they are before we do it?
well, yeah. So one of the questions we did ask is how old are you? So we'd only include the data from 16 to 18-year-olds. JC?
So some people drive and some people ride bus, but some students leave earlier than normal.
So maybe those students who leave early would be different. They would miss getting that, and they might be different than those who leave at the normal time. Tori?
True.
Survey didn't say out online,
Mm-hmm.
what kids might not have access to internet at home.
Oh yeah, if a student doesn't have access to internet at home, their data would be radically different than the ones who do have access to internet, right? Because if you don't have internet, you're not getting online. So this would be called, there's actually a name for this type of bias. It's measurement bias. No, this would be sampling bias. The sample would miss students who don't have internet.
That's a smiley face.
It's just an arrow.
I'll be dead.
Okay.
Oh, that did look smiley.
All right, there's one more that I'm looking for, and one student I did hear already say it. So, Owen, what were you talking about in your group?
I think I was talking about like different states. I was talking about like how maybe people in New York are on the internet more than people say like in the South.
There was something you were talking about before that, at the very beginning.
That's not
The extracurricular activities and football stuff.
Oh, okay. There's I guess like after you're done playing sports, you're not trained. So then when you're home, so you go home and you're just not.
Just don't think about doing
Yeah,
it.
you don't think about doing that
I think
anymore.
even before that, and this ties into that same idea, what you said was certain people would choose not to do the survey because they want to go muddying or whatever else.
Came up to me.
Yeah. Right? So I want y'all to hear me on this. This is probably one of the biggest issues with a survey like this. It's called voluntary response bias. Responders choose whether they want to participate. Because who is more likely to do this survey? Someone who is on the internet a lot or someone who's not on the internet a lot? Someone who's already on the internet a lot, right? And so we would get biased data. Anytime you have voluntary response, you're going to get biased data because the people who respond are going to be different than the ones who don't typically, right? So again, that idea of the people who are online are more likely to respond. If you're not online very often, that goes back to the issue of the people who don't have internet at home can't respond. Well, that set of data would be very different than the data from those who are online a good bit. Does that make sense? So that's the issue. Those are different considerations for bias that we want to be aware of. What are your questions before we continue?
Why you didn't call them?
Sorry, I
That's
have
what I
20.
was gonna say.
Oh, was it? My bad. I didn't hear you. And I didn't realize that you had that same thing. But, I mean, you've had lots of good ideas so
I
far.
had my hand up for the long hair. You called Key Anthony over me.
Because Kid didn't say nothing the whole time.
You did have something, you had your hand up at that same time, and that's my bad. But Anthony hadn't talked a lot. I am trying to engage more people who haven't been talking as much.
She took that personally.
It's not a strike at you. You've had a good conversation, and I appreciate that. But I'm trying to get others involved as well. Okay, so here's what we want to notice, right? We got to start getting into the different types of surveys. We've already talked a bit about or different types of studies. The first one we looked at was surveys, right? I would make this note to yourself. When you have a survey, you're going to directly ask somebody a question and record their responses. Directly ask a person questions. Right, those would be your survey questions, and record their responses. That's not how you spell responses.
We learned this, right?
I would, because 1.2 is looking specifically at observational data or observational studies and experiments, and I can't remember if they defined survey. They do have sample survey on getting started, so you can look there as well. But with surveys, you're going to directly ask a person questions and record their responses. But an observational study is different. What's a subject that you could try to collect data about, but you couldn't directly ask that thing a question? Say again? Yeah, if you wanted to collect data about plants, can you ask a plant a question? No. So we would need a different type of study for something like that, right? If you wanted to figure out, I'm trying to think of like 1,000 different things. If you're trying to figure out how effective a medicine is, you can't ask that medicine how effective it is. You need either an observational study or an experiment to figure that out, right? Most science concepts, I guess psychology things you can do surveys with, but most of other scientific ideas, you can't really do surveys. You would have to do observational studies or experiments. Yes, ma'am?
Why do people test like medicine and stuff on animals?
Well, let's say that medicine is something that might kill. We'd rather an animal die than a human die. If it causes cancer, well, would you rather have a rat get cancer from medicine or a human being?
A rat, but still, that rat didn't do anything.
It didn't, but we value human life over rat life.
It was a crime. It killed like 15 people.
Survival of the fittest. Alright, so here's where we are. Observational studies, right? Data are gathered about a characteristic of the population by simply observing and describing events in their natural settings. Notice, mathematicians are not original. I'm observing this thing, so it's an observational study. And so again, if you just observe, you're not directly asking questions, you're just observing. We're talking about an observational study. You record the number of children who use the swings at a local park. One of my students in AP Stats back in the day was just curious about people walking into the YMCA and how old they were. And he didn't directly talk to them, but he roughly estimated their age. That was an observational study, right? And I think he did research about early morning versus in the afternoon, and he found that typically older people went early morning to the Y to work out, versus in the afternoon it was typically younger people. Things like that, right? So it's just observing. The results of an observational study state that approximately 70% of in-house daycare centers in one U.S. state show as much as 2.5 hours of television to the children per day. The observational study examined 132 daycare centers in one state. And so we want to practice identifying these different things. Within your small groups, identify the population, the sample, and the characteristic of interest in the observational study. List some similarities and differences between observational studies and a sample survey. I think that's all I want for now. Yeah. So work within your small groups. Answer those 2 questions. Again, don't forget, your answers don't have to be perfect. We'll talk about it as a whole class, but generate some ideas.
I mean, it does. I mean, if it's like Kentucky,
Like, what if it's like West Virginia or something, dude?
it's not good. They don't have anything.
What about West Virginia?
And then, like, when you try to answer Kentucky, there's no.
Or like,
All they do was
North Dakota and South Dakota.
I've been there. I'm telling you.
That is
We
not
travel
all
a lot.
Kentucky, bro.
No, I'm saying that's just the beginning, like when you first
But-
enter, but like when you keep going, like it's.
But I mean, also like North Dakota and South Dakota. I think it depends on the state. Yeah. I don't know the state. Like, if it was, what if it's something like New York? Or what if it's something like Delaware?
Yeah, population
I
figure.
don't like Delaware. No, Delaware just makes me sick.
I had to have
So like, what if it's like Delaware? That could be very, very different. Delaware and New York.
In California.
Or like California.
I mean, even Alabama.
The characteristics of the information you're trying to gather.
That's one characteristic feature. Yeah. And what's the
This
same?
isn't representative. This is not representative.
This is an observation.
This would be a data.
Yeah. The results of an observational study state that approximately.
Population sample. All right, we already got the characteristics of interest. Then I'm just gonna watch this.
People in the daycare students.
I think it's biased.
But when it
But it's like 70%.
Well, the reason I'm saying biased is because it can't be representative. Like, it can't be representative. This is a bias. I mean, it could be representative of that state.
Yeah. But not as a whole
No,
one.
I mean, if they're trying to do like a whole, that's biased.
Yeah.
Because this could be Delaware for all we know.
Yeah.
You got that?
No. I mean, you did know. I'm just thinking.
Identify the population. Population could be in housing here.
Like I said, it also.
But it only says 70% though.
I know it says 70%. Like, that's like 70%.
But it also depends on what state. What if you're talking about the entire United States?
We're not talking about the entire town.
Well, whatever state is talking about.
No, like that.
Should have bought another.
So we got a new study now.
We got what the sample is.
So like,
Messing with
here, I will say this. Okay, so you got daycare centers and industrial
Mine
clusters.
today said.
So I would identify that population. And notice that would be all daycare centers in that state. So the sample would just be the daycare centers that were sampled, right? Does that make sense? So we're trying to make a prediction about all those daycare centers, but we can't collect data from all the daycare centers. So who did we collect data from?
So I don't know what.
Yes, you talk about it with the group.
I think that's about all we gotta say.
Do you not have your textbook with you?
It's still on my bed. I was actually, I swear, I was looking through it last night. I was like, let's see what we're gonna do.
She was writing word for word.
This morning, I was not feeling good.
She was writing.
I got volume 1, but not 2. And that threw me off.
Gotcha.
I'm right
Make sure you
here.
get to question 2. It looks like we
Oh,
have.
okay, sorry. I didn't
Now,
know.
you say biased sample. Does the question ask if it's biased or not?
Well, it says the sample, so I was like, I'm considering like.
So, what's the population?
70% they have things centers. It'd be daycare centers.
The population
Yeah.
of daycare centers.
So,
But it only says 70%.
remember, so one thing I'll point out is the population is everything from which you could collect data.
So what do you mean by that? It's
So,
like, are you talking like every state or like what?
well, what is the whole group that they are collecting data from?
In-house daycare centers.
Which ones though? Is it for all of the US? Is it for
It's just one state.
It's just for that one state. So the population, right? So think about that. The sample though, I'm not asking if it's biased or if it's representative. I'm just asking where the sample would be the group that you actually got data from.
So you would just put that one state? Or like, what would you?
So think about it.
That's why I said, it say approximately.
So if it's
70%.
one
We'll have a whole
challenge
class
would be
discussion in a
If it's,
second.
if it's one state, then it's representative, it's a representative sample, but like, so I guess the sample would be like that one state. I'm gonna put the state being.
All right, so we'll have a conversation just a second about number 1. If you haven't gotten to number 2 yet, start talking about number 2. And we'll add more details in if y'all are missing things. It's okay, but move on to the question 2.
Okay, I'm gonna put for number 2, random daycare and selected, not specific daycare. It's kind of like how they choose random.
Yeah. And I mean, there's probably, plus there's probably
Oh, we're
more.
looking for similarities, like random sample with that. What do you mean?
Sample, I just said.
For
It's a
what?
difference.
Two? Yes. Well, kind of like you said, they could also just pick random daycares. Because I'm sure there's more than 132 daycares. You know what I mean? Like there's like 10 here in Tuscaloosa. Huh?
A sample survey is what?
Oh,
So is that similarity or difference?
I mean, observation.
Okay. So I just want you to think about things that are similar and some things that are different. We'll talk about some other things that you may not even naturally see, but we'll add more in. So just add in some
I feel like
details.
observation is more deeper than a sample survey.
So I mean, I think like sample survey would be like, which river?
Like it's just based on observation of the key.
Yeah, like how much time do you spend online? Which favorite color? Like which favorite show? And I was go, what's the, how was your day? You know what I mean? Observational just kind of like looking. Like I can guarantee there's more 16-year-olds in this class than 15-year-olds, or more 17, 16-year-olds.
Sample is others opinions and not in data. And observational studies.
To ask questions and sample surveys, and observations you don't. You didn't even say what
Dude, I'm so.
no direct involvement.
I should have went to bed.
Basically, some of these observations
Bed at like 12.
observations sit.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Remember, guys, you don't have to get everything, but we learn from each other, so we're going to bring all these things together. So, I did have some people having some difficulty with identifying the population. So let me ask this question first. What do I mean by population? What do we in statistics mean by population?
What's being
A
observed?
specific group of, whatchamacallit, I forgot.
Okay, is it what's being studied?
No.
It's who or the group of things that's being studied, right? Now, is it just the people that or things that you collect data from, or is it the bigger group that specific group is coming from?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Is the population just the small group that you're collecting data from, or is it the whole big group that you're getting that smaller group from? Big group, right? The population is every single person or every single object that you could collect data from. Notice that key word is that you could collect data from. So are you going to collect data from everyone? No. What's the group that you actually get data from?
The ones that you,
That's the sample, right? The population is everything that you could get. The sample is who you actually get data from. So who is the population in this study about daycare centers in that one U.S. state? What's the population? Is it the kids? It's just the daycare centers, right? It's okay. We just don't notice we don't need kids here. But the population is there any other details about daycare center that we should add in? For the population? Okay. Does anybody want to push back on that or add on to the idea that we have 132 daycare centers? That's our population?
70%.
No, that's how 70% is the group that watch a certain amount of TV.
Okay, so 70% of a group actually watch TV. What I will say is this. Isn't that the actual data that was collected? That's the thing that we can use to make a prediction. But remember, what is the big group that we could collect data from? So you're saying like all of them?
Yeah.
Not just the 132, but every single daycare center?
Yes.
So remember, we can't get to every daycare center, but that's who I want to make a prediction about, right? And so I would also say it's not just daycare centers, it's in-house, right? So all in-house daycare centers in that state. Notice, you could always expand that, but this survey or this study, the study was specifically for that state, right? We're not looking at all of the US. I guess I should have put sample after that. So, sample, who or what was the specific group that we actually got data from?
The 132.
Is it the 132 or the 70%?
132.
So we actually got, they're not exactly the same. Of those 132, 70% showed, was it 2.5 hours or more?
Yeah.
Which meant that 30% didn't show 2.5 hours or more, right? But who did we actually get data from? The 132. Right? The 132 daycare centers from which data was collected. Yes, Madison? I know, I need to. Well, that's not going to help you, what I'm writing right now. But I will get up there in a second. I had to update the app, and it was a hassle. I'll get that done before we come back together for the next one. Okay. Characteristic of interest then. Remember, this is the piece of information we're trying to collect. What was the characteristic of interest? Time spent. Watching TV. Does anybody want to add on to that or push back on that?
Would we put 2.5 hours because they've already collected it?
Well, once they have collected it, but before the study, had they collected that information?
We're doing this before.
So, okay, this,
Where's my
notice, right, the results of an observational study state that approximately 70% of in-house care centers in one U.S. state show as much as 2.5 hours of television to the children per day.
So we looked at it what it was before, or now that they had it before?
Well, the question would have, what would the question have been when researchers were collecting this data? Just how much time was spent. Once they found out how much time was spent, then they knew that it was 70% showed as much as 2.5 hours. Does that make sense? Okay. But yeah, the characteristic of interest, the information they were trying to collect in the study was just time spent watching TV. They may have been looking for that 2.5 hours, just the way the question's worded, I wouldn't have thought that they knew they were looking at 2.5 hours, right? Yes, Kaya? Yeah, right, so time spent watching TV per day would be actually a good detail to add in there, right? That's a good thing to add on. Because it's not per week, it's not per month, it's per day. So that sounds like a lot. Okay. So what are your questions, comments, or concerns at this point? Huh? Yeah. Okay, it doesn't look like we have any. What are some similarities then and differences for observational studies and experiment, or observational studies and surveys? JC.
I have a question about
Okay, go for it.
Okay, what is the difference between population and sector? Like, it's going back to the same thing, if you really think about it. Like, they're both about the daycares.
Well, so the sample will always be from the population, but notice the population is all of the daycare centers. The sample is who you actually got data from, right? So this is, so population is the big group. And I'll say this, it's the big group you're trying to make a prediction about.
You gonna eat it? Thanks.
The sample though, that is the specific group from whom you got data. make a prediction. So again, can you collect data about every daycare center in that entire state? No, that would take way too long. But when those 132 daycare centers were observed, 70% of them showed up to 2.5 hours of television per day. So what prediction, if it's a representative sample, what prediction can we make about all daycare centers in that state?
That a majority of them watch television.
Not just the majority of them, approximately 70% of them watch as much as 2.5 hours, right? So does that answer your question, JC? Right, so again, we only have data from those 132. But as long as that sample was representative, I can extrapolate, make a prediction about that whole group. Okay? For instance, another way to think about it is, let's say I wanted to make a prediction about Hillcrest High School, right? What percent of students are planning on going to the homecoming dance? I assume we have a homecoming dance, don't we?
Yes.
Yes? So what percent of students are trying to go to the homecoming dance? Well, I'm not going to ask every single student at the school, but I would collect data from a sample. This class could be a sample. Might be a biased sample, but this class would be a small, specific group from whom I could get data. Does that make sense? That help clarify? It's a good question there. Okay, similarities and differences between observational studies and surveys. Give me one, Hudson.
And surveys, you get involved to ask questions, and observations, there's no direct involvement.
Okay, so differences, questions, and direct involvement, right? Surveys. I would say questions to sample, right? So you actually direct those questions to a sample. Because there will be questions in an observational study, but that's your idea of the direct involvement versus observing and no direct involvement or indirect involvement. Okay, before we move on from just that, does anybody want to push back on that at all or add any details on that? Say again.
You only watch them, so I guess that's like the same thing.
Yeah, that's what observing is. Yeah, so you're just watching. Okay, Jackson, you had your hand up. What you got? And Devin, I'll get to you next.
Both of them, you're gathering information from a certain group of people.
Only collecting data from a sample, from a specific group of people, right? Collecting data, I might want to include that word. So we're collecting data from a sample, from a specific group of people. Devlin.
It was the same, yes.
Oh, is that what you're actually going to say as well? Okay. Anything else? Gabby.
The observation might take longer than survey.
Interesting. What do y'all think about that? Could an observational study take longer?
Yeah.
But it could
Depending on your
question.
It could depend on the question, but I would agree on that for sure. Like that observational study could take longer. Surveys sometimes can take long, but usually you're going to ask direct questions that day, right? So observational studies might take longer. What else? Kaya?
So on the definition, instead of describing events in their natural setting on observational study, would you not be doing that in the sample survey?
Well, in a sample survey, because you're directly asking them a question, you're not going to see them in their natural habitat, right? So we would actually observe those daycare centers in the daycare center, right? But in a sample survey, I might just reach out to the director and ask him a question. Does that make?
Would be a difference.
And so that's the direct involvement, asking those questions versus actually being there but not getting directly involved by asking a question. So that's just a different way of framing that. So that's a good point. But yeah. Anything else that we want to add on? Jackson?
An observational study can be less accurate, so it's not directly, getting your information like you want.
Interesting. I'm going to push back on that because I would actually say, I would think an observational study might be more accurate because how often do people misrepresent what they do? Like if I was going to ask a daycare center, how much time do you let kids watch TV every day? I might look at that 2.5 hours and be like, whew, I let them watch way too much. It's only an hour and a half a day. Does that make sense? So like people will give you false responses. But if you directly observe it, there's no way for them to lie to you. You actually see it. Does that make sense? That's personally what I would think. But that's a good point, right? Good thing to think about. Accuracy in data. That's a difference. We'll just say it that way. We don't know which one, but accuracy in data. Anything else we want to add in, Melvorier? You awake? Head up, please. All right, any more? So I'm going to give you one of the similarities, and this similarity is very important. It's going to set these two off from experiments. Are the researchers manipulating variables?
Nope.
No.
Nope.
That's a similarity. Researchers don't manipulate variables. Yes, Anthony.
Manipulate variables, what you mean?
We'll talk about that when we get to experiments. Good question, though. The other thing I will point out is this. In an observational study and a survey, and in surveys, what do you want to be true about your samples? You want them to be what?
Accurate?
So what do we mean by accurate? What's
Correct.
the mathematical term for that?
Oh.
Or the statistical term?
Representative.
Say it again. Representative, right?
Good job.
Want samples to be representative. So we can make a what about the population? Make a prediction. The true statistical term, which I'm not going to use regularly or test you on, but it's an inference, but so that you can make accurate predictions. All right? Remember, the whole thing is that we're going to start with a question, and we want to collect data to make those predictions about the population.